In this video, I explained every single standard weapon in Cuphead in just 6 minutes. Let me know what your favorite weapon is down in the comments. So of course, the first weapon I'm going to be talking about is the Peashooter. Now this weapon is as basic as it gets. Pretty moderate damage with a high rate of fire. The DPS this weapon brings to the table is pretty average, being at just 30 damage. And the EX for this weapon does 25 damage a hit, which is also not too bad. At first glance, the Peashooter seems pretty effective, but since all the shots are completely straight, you have kind of a hard time taking out enemies from above. So that's why I'm going to have to give this weapon a 6 out of 10. The next gun I'm going to be talking about is Chaser. Now Chaser has the lowest DPS in the game, coming in at 17 damage, but Chaser does come with his own perks. The main one of this weapon is that you don't have to aim at all. So that means you can pretty much just keep your finger on the trigger, run around aimlessly, and you're still going to be doing damage. Definitely not a high amount though. But besides the low DPS, another con about this weapon is the EX, which has got to be the worst one in the game. It spawns 4 projectiles that kind of just circle around you, and after hitting an enemy with all of them, it still only does a measly 28 damage. Now I know that is more damage than some other EXs, but it's just not very convenient to use. Me personally, I would just use it as a worse version of the Spread EX, which isn't too bad in the end. Now for the rating of this weapon, for most players I would give this a 6 out of 10, but for newer players I would bump it up to a 7. Now for one of my personal favorite weapons, we have the Spreadshot. Now this weapon has the highest DPS in the game, but it also has the lowest range in the game. When fighting bosses like Beppy the Clown, the Spreadshot is a necessity, as they're really close to the boss and pretty much all the shots from the spread hit, which does a ton of damage in the end. And not to mention the EX is also one of the better ones, as it can do up to 34 damage when all shots hit, which is actually pretty easy on certain bosses. But even if you can't make all the shots hit, the EX is still great for killing surrounding enemies. So pretty much the only con about this weapon is the short range, so that's why I'm going to give this a 9 out of 10. The next weapon I'm going to be talking about is the Roundabout. Now this is a lot of people's favorite weapons, and I can definitely see why. It has a good DPS of 32 damage a second, and has insane range when aiming backwards. I mean, you don't even have to face the enemy half the time, as the shots just boomerang and hit him on the way back. Now the Roundabout also has a good EX, which can deal up to 40 damage. Considering all of this about the Roundabout, I'm gonna have to give him a 9.5 out of 10. Now let's talk about the Lobber. The Lobber for me is another personal favorite, as this weapon does high damage and also has a pretty decent range. At first glance, it looks like the Lobber's range is actually pretty limited, but each projectile from this weapon can actually bounce a bunch of times, which definitely extends the range. The EX for the Lobber does 28 damage a shot, which is pretty good considering how easy it is to hit enemies with this. But the reason I like the Lobber so much is because of the ability to Lobber trap enemies, which is pretty much just jumping up and shooting at the same time. So when the enemy eventually spawns in, they get hit by all the projectiles. And that's going to bring me to my rating of the Lobber, which is an 8 out of 10. And now for the last non-DLC weapon, I'm going to be talking about the Charge Shot. The Charge Shot actually has a DPS of 35, which is absolutely insane, but it does come with a few complications. The first one being that if you want to do maximum damage, you have to charge up the shot for a whole second, which isn't really that bad, but this brings me to the second downside of this weapon, which is the uncharged shot, that does a whopping 6 damage. So if you're going to use this weapon, just please fully charge your shots. The EX for the charge shot is okay. I mean, the damage is okay, and the range is pretty short, so yeah, not much to talk about there, but overall, I would give this weapon a 7.5 out of 10. And before I get into the DLC weapons, this is my first Cuphead video ever on this channel, so if you want me to make more videos like this, or you're just enjoying this one so far, consider hitting that subscribe button. Anyways, let's hop into the DLC weapons. The first one I'll be talking about is the Crackshot. To me, this guy's probably the best weapon in the game. The reason for that is the high damage, and it's basically just a better version of Chaser. So even if you end up missing your shots, you could still be doing up to 18 DPS, pretty much for free. Now the Crackshot's EX is actually pretty interesting, as it summons a turret that shoots at enemies, and that can also be parried for extra damage. And since the EX for this weapon is also really good, I'm gonna have to give the Crackshot a 9.5 out of 10. And now for the second DLC weapon, I'll be talking about the Converge. This weapon shoots 3 lines of projectiles, and if all of these shots hit, it will give you a DPS of 33 damage, which is definitely pretty nice. enemies. Also, when using this weapon, if you lock on, the spread becomes more minimal and makes it easier to hit enemies with all your shots. The EX for this weapon is pretty weak as it only does 21 damage, but at least the range is unlimited. Overall, the Converge isn't really that great, and it does kind of hurt me to say this since I do use this weapon, but I'm gonna give it a 7 out of 10. And now for the final weapon of this video, I'll be talking about the Twist Up. So pretty much everybody in the Cuphead community has a love-hate relationship with this weapon, and me personally, I think it's alright. I definitely don't think it's as bad as some people say, as the Twist Up can do up to 32 damage a second, which is actually quite good. And to be honest, the Twist Up just reminds me of an upward version of the Lobber, except it's a little bit faster and does a teeny bit less damage. The EX for this weapon sends a tornado that kind of just runs around the screen, and since I don't really use Twist Up, it's really hard for me to aim with this EX, but I know some people would say otherwise. Anyways, my final thoughts on the Twist Up is that it's not the best weapon, it's definitely not the worst, but I'd still give it a 7.5 out of 10. And that is all the standard weapons in Cuphead explained in 6 minutes. And feel free to disagree with my list because, you know, I'm not perfect at Cuphead. And also let me know if you want me to make more of these in the future. And I'll see you in the next one.